When Portuguese ships first touched the shores of what would become Brazil in 1500, the men aboard had been at sea for months. They were Catholic, conservative, and had never seen anything like what awaited them on those beaches. The indigenous Tupi women walked freely without European clothing, their bodies painted with intricate designs, adorned with feathers and natural ornaments. What happened next would be documented in letters, journals, and official reports that still exist today. The reactions of these Portuguese colonizers reveal a complex mix of fascination, confusion, religious panic, and desires that would reshape an entire continent. Pedro Alvarez Cabral's crew had expected to find India. Instead, they found something that challenged every assumption they held about civilization, morality, and human nature. The cultural collision that followed produced some of the most bizarre documented behaviors in colonial history. Before we dive into these incredible historical accounts, if you're fascinated by untold stories from history like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really helps us bring you more amazing historical content that you won't find anywhere else. Now, let's explore what really happened when these two worlds collided. The first Portuguese to set foot on Brazilian soil literally fell to their knees, not in prayer, but in shock. Pero Vaz de Caminha, the expedition's scribe, wrote to King Manuel I describing indigenous women as very well formed with hair that was very black and long. But what disturbed him most wasn't their appearance. It was their complete lack of shame about nudity. European men of 1500 lived in a world where women covered everything from neck to ankle. Even married couples rarely saw each other fully undressed. The Catholic Church taught that the human body was a source of sin and temptation. Suddenly, these Portuguese sailors found themselves surrounded by women who treated their bodies as natural and beautiful. The psychological impact was immediate and intense. Ship's chaplain, Father Henrique, documented cases of men who couldn't speak for hours after first encountering Tupi villages. Others became obsessively religious, spending entire days in prayer, begging God to remove the impure thoughts from their minds. But perhaps the strangest reaction came from a group of soldiers who decided the only rational explanation was that they had died at sea and gone to some kind of Catholic purgatory. They refused to eat local food, convinced that accepting anything from this otherworldly place would trap their souls forever. The Portuguese crown had prepared its explorers for many scenarios: hostile natives, dangerous animals, tropical diseases. Nobody had prepared them for indigenous societies where women held positions of power, where nudity was normal, and where European concepts of modesty simply didn't exist. Commander João de Oliveira ordered his men to avoid looking directly at indigenous women during diplomatic meetings. He feared that extended eye contact might drive his sailors to abandon their Christian faith entirely. This led to absurd scenes where Portuguese negotiators conducted crucial trade discussions while staring at the ground or sky, desperately trying to avoid seeing the very people they were supposed to be talking to. The cultural misunderstandings multiplied rapidly. When Tupi women offered traditional welcome gifts, often involving physical contact and ceremonial touching, Portuguese men interpreted these gestures through their own cultural lens. Some believed they were being seduced. Others thought they were being tested by God. Father Miguel documented the case of sailor Antonio Ferreira, who became convinced that indigenous women could read his thoughts. Ferreira started wearing multiple layers of clothing in the tropical heat, believing that if he covered himself completely, the mind-reading powers of native women would be blocked. He nearly died of heat exhaustion before other crew members intervened. The obsession with indigenous nudity led to increasingly bizarre attempts at conversion. Portuguese missionaries began designing special modesty clothing that they insisted native women wear during religious ceremonies. These garments were completely impractical for tropical climates and indigenous lifestyles. Many indigenous people accepted them politely during meetings, then immediately removed them afterward. One group of Portuguese settlers became so fixated on covering up indigenous women that they spent months learning to weave palm fronds into clothing. They then presented these crude garments as gifts, apparently believing that their poor craftsmanship would somehow transform indigenous culture. The most documented strange behavior involved Portuguese men who started adopting indigenous customs, but only partially. They would paint their bodies like Tupi warriors while keeping their European clothing. They learned indigenous languages, but only to discuss Christian theology. These cultural hybrid experiments typically ended badly, with the men accepted by neither Portuguese nor indigenous communities. Letters from colonists to their families in Portugal reveal an obsession with describing indigenous women's bodies in scientific terms. They measured everything: height, proportions, skin tone variations. Some historians believe this obsessive documentation was a psychological defense mechanism, allowing Portuguese men to intellectualize their encounters rather than confronting their emotional responses. The arrival of Portuguese women in later colonial expeditions created new complications. European wives and daughters, already suspicious of indigenous people, became violently jealous of the attention their husbands and fathers paid to native women. This led to bizarre social rules in early colonial settlements, where Portuguese men were forbidden from making eye contact with indigenous women even during business transactions. Religious authorities struggled to provide guidance for situations that had no precedent in Catholic doctrine. Could indigenous nudity be considered sinful if the people involved had never heard of Christian modesty rules? Were Portuguese men committing sins by simply seeing unclothed indigenous women? The theological debates that resulted would continue for decades. Some Portuguese colonizers developed what modern psychologists might recognize as obsessive-compulsive behaviors. They would cross themselves dozens of times after seeing indigenous women, or recite specific prayers in predetermined sequences. One merchant, Gonzalo Pires, kept detailed journals recording every time he encountered indigenous nudity, along with lengthy prayers of forgiveness. The economic impact of these cultural collisions was significant. Portuguese traders often made poor business decisions because they were too distracted or uncomfortable to focus on negotiations. Indigenous leaders learned to use this psychological advantage, sending their most impressive women to trade meetings when they wanted better deals. Colonial authorities eventually established official protocols for Portuguese indigenous interactions. These included mandatory waiting periods between first contact and formal negotiations, required presence of priests during all meetings, and detailed codes of conduct specifying where Portuguese men could and couldn't look during conversations. The psychological stress of cultural adaptation led to what colonial documents describe as tropical madness, Portuguese men who abandoned European customs entirely and attempted to integrate completely into indigenous communities. Most of these attempts failed dramatically, as the men lacked understanding of indigenous social structures, spiritual beliefs, and survival skills. Perhaps the strangest documented case involved Portuguese nobleman Fernão Cardim, who became convinced that indigenous women possessed supernatural powers because they seemed comfortable in their natural state, while he felt constantly anxious and conflicted. Cardim spent his fortune hiring indigenous shamans to cure him of his European modesty, believing it was a spiritual illness. The long-term consequences of these initial cultural shocks shaped Brazilian colonial society for centuries. Portuguese men who couldn't adapt to indigenous customs often became increasingly authoritarian and controlling. Those who adapted too quickly were viewed with suspicion by other colonists. The middle ground, respectful coexistence, proved difficult for men raised in dramatically different cultural contexts. Modern historians studying colonial documents note that Portuguese obsession with indigenous nudity often overshadowed more significant cultural differences. While colonists wrote extensively about clothing and body shame, they paid less attention to indigenous political systems, agricultural techniques, or spiritual practices that might have been more valuable to document. The irony wasn't lost on some contemporary observers. Jesuit priest José de Anchieta noted that Portuguese men, who claimed to be shocked by indigenous nudity, showed no similar concern about the violence, exploitation, and environmental destruction that accompanied colonial expansion. Their moral outrage seemed highly selective. These early encounters set patterns that would define Portuguese indigenous relationships throughout the colonial period. The inability of many Portuguese colonizers to see indigenous women as complete human beings, viewing them instead as either temptations to be avoided or objects to be controlled, contributed to centuries of exploitation and cultural destruction. The documented reactions of Portuguese colonizers to their first encounters with indigenous communities reveal as much about European psychological limitations as they do about indigenous cultures. The bizarre behaviors, obsessive documentation, and desperate attempts to impose European norms on completely different societies show men struggling to process experiences that challenge their fundamental worldview. Understanding these historical reactions helps explain how cultural misunderstandings can escalate into lasting conflicts. The Portuguese colonizers' inability to adapt respectfully to indigenous customs contributed to the tragic destruction of sophisticated societies that had thrived for thousands of years. The legacy of these first encounters reminds us that cultural collisions require wisdom, humility, and genuine respect for different ways of life. The Portuguese who succeeded in Brazil were those who learned to appreciate indigenous knowledge and customs, rather than simply trying to impose their own beliefs and behaviors on others. The psychological documentation from this period reveals patterns that would be repeated across colonial expansions worldwide. Portuguese reactions to indigenous nudity became a template for European responses to non-European cultures. A mixture of fascination, fear, and the desperate need to impose familiar social structures on unfamiliar situations. Colonial surgeon Mestre João recorded detailed observations of Portuguese men experiencing what he called tropical fever, not a physical illness, but a psychological condition triggered by prolonged exposure to indigenous communities. Symptoms included inability to concentrate, obsessive letter writing to families in Portugal, and compulsive religious behaviors. The surgeon noted that men who acknowledged and discussed their cultural confusion recovered faster than those who denied any psychological impact. The strangest documented treatment for tropical fever involved Portuguese colonists creating elaborate theatrical performances, where they acted out idealized versions of indigenous European interactions. These plays, performed for other colonists, allowed Portuguese men to process their cultural anxieties through drama while maintaining their sense of European superiority. Indigenous people who witnessed these performances reportedly found them amusing but completely incomprehensible. Religious authorities developed increasingly complex theological arguments to justify Portuguese presence in indigenous territories. Dominican friar Bartolomeo de las Casas argued that God had placed naked indigenous peoples in European paths as a test of Christian virtue. This reasoning led to bizarre missionary practices where Portuguese priests would deliberately expose themselves to indigenous communities, then document their spiritual struggles with temptation as proof of their religious dedication. The economic exploitation that followed these initial cultural encounters was systematically planned around Portuguese psychological weaknesses. Portuguese merchants, who were easily distracted by cultural differences, found themselves manipulated by indigenous leaders who had quickly learned to use European discomfort as a negotiating advantage. Trade agreements from this period show remarkably favorable terms for indigenous communities, not because Portuguese negotiators were generous, but because they were psychologically unprepared for the negotiations. Colonial administrator Tomé de Sousa established the first official guidelines for Portuguese indigenous interactions in 1549. These rules included mandatory cultural preparation periods, where newly arrived Portuguese men spent weeks in isolated compounds, gradually exposed to images and descriptions of indigenous customs before any direct contact. The preparation process was designed to prevent the psychological shock that had incapacitated earlier colonists. The most detailed documentation of Portuguese psychological adaptation comes from the journals of Jesuit missionary Manuel de Nóbrega. He spent years studying Portuguese colonists who had successfully integrated into indigenous communities versus those who had failed. His observations revealed that successful adaptation required abandoning European concepts of cultural superiority, something most Portuguese men found psychologically impossible. Nóbrega documented cases of Portuguese men who developed split personalities as coping mechanisms. During official colonial business, they maintained strict European behavioral standards. In private interactions with indigenous communities, they adopted completely different personas, speaking indigenous languages and following local customs. These psychological divisions often led to mental breakdowns when the conflicting identities could no longer be maintained. The arrival of African enslaved people in Brazilian colonies created new psychological complications for Portuguese colonists already struggling with indigenous cultural differences. European men who had spent years learning to navigate one set of non-European customs suddenly faced another completely different cultural system. Some Portuguese colonists simply withdrew from cross-cultural interactions entirely, creating isolated European settlements that had minimal contact with either indigenous or African communities. Colonial documents reveal that Portuguese women who eventually arrived in Brazil often adapted more successfully to indigenous customs than their male counterparts. European women, already marginalized in Portuguese society, found aspects of indigenous gender roles more appealing than European restrictions. This created household tensions where Portuguese wives adopted indigenous practices while their husbands desperately tried to maintain European traditions. The psychological stress of cultural adaptation contributed to widespread alcoholism among Portuguese colonists. Colonial authorities reported that European men consumed dangerous quantities of locally produced alcoholic beverages while attempting to participate in indigenous social rituals. Many Portuguese colonists couldn't distinguish between social drinking and religious ceremony in indigenous contexts, leading to embarrassing diplomatic incidents and damaged relationships with indigenous leaders. Portuguese attempts to civilize indigenous peoples by introducing European clothing created unintended consequences that colonists hadn't anticipated. Indigenous people often modified European garments to suit their own aesthetic preferences and practical needs. The result was hybrid clothing styles that Portuguese colonists found deeply disturbing, neither properly European nor authentically indigenous, but something entirely new that challenged colonial assumptions about cultural categories. The most extensive documentation of Portuguese cultural confusion comes from the correspondence between colonial administrators and the Portuguese crown. These letters reveal European officials desperately seeking guidance for situations that had no precedent in European experience. The Crown's responses show equal confusion, with contradictory orders that reflected the impossibility of governing colonial situations from thousands of miles away using European legal frameworks. Portuguese colonists developed elaborate ranking systems to categorize different types of indigenous communities based on their adherence to European modesty standards. These classifications had serious legal and economic consequences, determining which indigenous groups received trading privileges, missionary attention, or military protection. The arbitrary nature of these rankings revealed the extent to which Portuguese colonists used familiar cultural categories to impose order on unfamiliar situations. The psychological impact of prolonged cultural exposure led some Portuguese colonists to question fundamental European beliefs about civilization, religion, and human nature. Colonial authorities identified these men as potential threats to colonial stability and established monitoring systems to identify Portuguese colonists who showed signs of excessive cultural sympathy. Men who praised indigenous customs too enthusiastically faced investigation and possible deportation back to Portugal. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of documented Portuguese reactions is how they exposed European insecurities about their own cultural practices. Portuguese men who claimed to be shocked by indigenous nudity were simultaneously wearing clothing that was completely impractical for tropical climates. Their insistence on maintaining European dress codes in Brazilian conditions revealed that cultural practices often had more to do with identity and power than practical functionality. The long-term consequences of these psychological and cultural conflicts shaped Brazilian society in ways that persist today. The Portuguese inability to develop respectful cross-cultural relationships established patterns of exploitation and misunderstanding that influenced centuries of Brazilian social development. Modern Brazil still struggles with the legacy of colonial attitudes that viewed indigenous and African cultures as problems to be solved rather than sophisticated systems to be understood and respected. These documented reactions from 500 years ago reveal timeless truths about human nature, cultural misunderstanding, and the dangers of imposing our worldview on others. If you found these historical accounts as fascinating as I did, please subscribe for more incredible untold stories from history. Hit that like button if this opened your eyes to something new about colonial history, and let me know in the comments which reaction surprised you the most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video with another amazing historical story you've probably never heard before.